I'm Gerhard Kasper. I'm the trustee in residence at the American Academy, and my function is often to introduce the fellows who speak, unless there's somebody better to do that. And tonight we have somebody better to do that, and therefore I'm not supposed to say anything about Renée, but only about Diederichsen, who is introducing Renée. He has known her since the 90s. Now that poses obviously a problem for me, and so I want to, the way I can talk about Renée is to quote something he wrote about you, and then we'll go and introduce him. In the catalogue to an exhibition Renée had at the Musée Cantonal des Beaux-Arts in Lausanne with the wonderful title, Ongoing Becomings. I mean, that is ingenious, really, the exhibition had. Diederich is writing some about Renée there and about what he calls artist journeys. And I want to read just a couple of sentences from it. Instead of reducing the aspiration for a journey representing life to a simple holiday trip, the ambition is raised by Renée and her protagonists. The individuals involved become explorers. Their journals and correspondence are full of reading lists, texts, and pieces of music. Bands and writers crop up as figures again and again. The journey leads to encounters. These encounters trigger questions, doubts, and debates among the characters in the traveller's tales. It proceeds as in a proper Entwicklungsroman, only most of the people, most of the voices do not come from the world opened up on the journey, but from books taken along and remembered or longed for. Now, this is very much, I have been reading a lot, Renée, of your work, and this rings true. This rings true. So here's my job is to introduce Diederichsen. The first good thing to say about him is he was born in Hamburg. If you listen to my Chicago accent, you can hear the Hamburg undertones in my Chicago accent. I spent 26 years in Chicago. He has been a professor of theory. This is a wonderful title, by the way. A professor of theory, practice, and communication of contemporary art at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna since 2006. But before that, he did lots of interesting things, like he served as the editor-in-chief of the most prominent German rock and pop culture magazine, Specs, which he did from 85 to 90. He has published many books. One of them, Diederich, is called The Whole Earth, Kalifornien und das Verschwinden des Außen. Außen is very difficult to translate into English. How would you translate it?
There's a bilingual publication. It's called The Disappearance of the Outside.
Yeah, the outside. I would have, thank you. That confirms my sense of language. I would have said outside, but I'm glad to have that confirmed. So The Whole Earth, California, and the Disappearance of the Outside. And it is about the counter-cultural revolution in California. And I would like you to know that I was there. I arrived, my first academic appointment was at Berkeley, and I arrived in 1964, and within 2 weeks of my arrival on the Berkeley campus, the beginning of the French Revolution took place, the free speech movement. And of course, the free speech movement led to everything else, in California and everywhere else for that matter. Diederich is, as I said, an expert on Renée, and he will take over immediately. I just wanted to call your attention to two things, and that is Renée those who will be interested, in particular after her talk, in her work, will have a solo exhibition at Nagel Draxler Kabinett in the Rosa-Luxemburg-Straße, and that will open on November 8th. And you will, of course, all go there. And Dietrich has another exhibition opening and a conference curated with Anselm Franke at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt called Love and Ethnology, the Colonial Dialectic of Sensitivity. Now there comes then, the title has a parenthetical remark, after Hubert Fichte. Since I have no clue who Hubert Fichte is, I'm omitting that. So I'm not, also from Hamburg. Oh well, good, great. I give this to you, turn this over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this local patriotic introduction. I come back to Fichte because Renée is also in that show. No? Also those people who come to the show at Nagel Draxler also should go to that one, but I'm talking about that later. The task to introduce Renée here came to me as something that I thought was in the context of an audience that would not know her. But now it turns out that almost half of the audience are also old friends who could do the introduction as good or even better than me. So kind of half of the things I'm doing, half of the speech acts are preaching to the converted. For the rest is what I'm saying now. Renée became visible as an artist in the early 90s, and she was considered then by the public or the art-interested public as part of a generation that broke in many ways with previous art production in the metropolises of the global Northwest by a type of art practice seemed to be foremost mainly content-driven, but more important than that, also aware and critical of the context that made content possible, the context of the art world, its symbolic conventions, and, for example, overcoming the border between the work proper and all the other things you would have to know, by including all kinds of information systems, communication devices, media, art forms that were often, for at that time, easy to identify whether what is the main thing, what is the paragon, and by that addressing the entire communicative and social process of art, questioning especially the role of the artist, the gallery, and the main components of the institution of art. As we knew it then and still know it now, the institution of art as a cultural product of a bourgeois, white, and male-dominated society. That was till then, I think, only a voluntaristic act here and there in the history of avant-garde art or contemporary art before that period, but became then more and more like a programmatic, and so that was the first way her shows or her practice was understood and received and debated. And it seemed that any medium, any area of cultural production could be part of this and could help with this. Films, archival installations, all kinds of material that would be offered for understanding textile objects, and also a lot of products of the applied and decorative arts. Wallpapers, furnitures, figurines, found objects and original objects. All held together by a logic of argumentation, narrative, a structure that would at points seem to be associative, and then again making a point against something or for something. Very important was also the inclusion of sound and music, the cultural representations of sound and music, as album covers and newspapers, magazines, images, but then also writing. There are a lot of written text or spoken text in connection with Renée's work, and a certain form of research. And that research was conducted also in many different ways. I mean, it was there's a lot of reading of other people's text. There's a lot of quoting and collaging of quotes and interviews with people who were in certain important points of networks, or practitioners, specialists, and so on, and travelogues. Like we've already heard, there's a lot of journeys and traveling involved. But it turned out that it was not the case that all these many different components coming from so many different cultural and artistic practices, from being an archivist, a librarian, to being a filmmaker, that the mediatic elements of these, I would say, essayistic installations were really taken from a completely open and endless world of resources. They were themselves, and that was different from many of the other artists at that time that Renée was compared with. They were in themselves very personal and, I would even say, stylish. They were also, among many other things, even a form of handwriting. So the process of connecting all these different elements and bringing them together in lines of argument or in essayistic traces had a specific individual style, even, like I said, a form of handwriting. Especially the style of her movies, they often were like not just one movie, but 6 or 8 in one installation. The way she used topography, all these forms were in themselves were showing a very specific approach, a very specific style. So the analogy of the category essayistic installation to the well-known category essay film would have at least 2 meanings in this context. That diaristic writing and essayistic filming that the category of the essay film is normally associated with were indeed a huge part of many of Renée's work. But also the entire project was and is marked by the dialectic relation between a very personal and subjective outlook based on actual travels that had taken place and research travels that had taken place, and a dedication to themes, to historical, political, and real-world history and narratives, yes, also factual, even journalistic research. This very unique and through this methodology, Renée Green became one of the most important artists of her generation, because this was actually the realization of what the problems that this generation had faced in in those early days when they first appeared, had given as a promise, but only very few people have like realized this as an ongoing project. Yeah, I mean, I'm following this since almost 30 years, yeah. Like since the early 90s, so that's, yeah, 27 or something like that years. And we've often also worked together in very different roles. I mean, inviting each other to also very different kinds of events, from playing in one's narrative or film or show, or but also relatively conventional to conferences and symposia, and so there are a lot of those. I mean, probably 7 or 8 instances that I'm not going to tell you now because it's not a talk about all my encounters with her. But I think it's very important that there are, at least in these encounters, a few reoccurring themes, and the very famous early show of Renée, Import Export, the Funk Office, had in this title already the problem or the theme of import export, which is today has reached all those debates on appropriation, and which kind of echoing these the themes that were central for this project. And he was also part of a conference I did in the late 90s in Berlin, Loving the Alien, which was a conference on Afrofuturism in the Volksbühne, and just recently a huge volume of her collected writings, I think in 2014 or 15, came out, called Other Planes of There, which is a reference to Sun Ra, who was like a central figure of that other conference. Then, like I already said, traveling has been a recurring subject in all fields, and that would be the last, the current encounter in the writing and projects of Hubert Fichte, where we already had a public conversation in 1994 in New York, and which is now going to become a show at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in next month, and opening on October 17, where again Renée will be a contributor and a speaker on the symposium. So this is like a very brief wrap up for all of you who have not heard of Renée Green and her work and are not so familiar with art issues. For the others, you know these stories, and so give the floor to Renée.
Wow, thank you for those introductions, and yeah, I think it's made what I'm going to do a bit easier. Actually, drop my paper. But yeah, I'm sort of following all of that was said, and having all kinds of questions and thoughts of my own about them. But I'm really happy to be back in Berlin and to be able to see so many familiar faces and old friends, and what Dietrich was mentioning about half the room or some of the people also being able to have their own thoughts about what's taken place over all of these various years. I'm very happy to be able to spend some time here, to be able to engage in other conversations with people, and there have been waves of people now from different parts of the world who I'm engaging with and who are now here in Berlin, and I'm very happy about that. And so I think that actually it was fascinating for me to listen to what Dietrich was describing about this person called Renée Green, who's often a persona. And so what I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to be reading from an adaptation of the introduction of a new book that I'm in the process of finishing. It's called Pacing. While I'm reading, there will be unexplained slideshows while I continue to speak. So, I'll begin. Pacing. Definition. 1. A rate of movement, especially in stepping, walking, etc., to hike at a pace of 3 miles an hour. 2. A rate of activity, progress, growth, performance, etc., tempo. 3. Any of various standard lineal measures representing the space naturally measured by the movement of the feet in walking, geometrical pace, military pace, Roman pace. 4. A single step. She took 3 paces in the direction of the door. 5. The distance covered in a step. Stand 6 paces inside the gates. 6. A manner of stepping, gait. 7. A gait of a horse or other animal in which the feet on the same side are lifted and put down together. 8. Any of the gaits of a horse. 9. A raised step or platform. 10. Put one through one's paces to prove ability or show skill. The French teacher put her pupils through their paces for the visitors. 11. Set the pace. To act as an example for others to rival. Be the most progressive or successful. An agency that sets the pace in advertising. 12. Obscure. A herd of asses. 13. To set the pace for, as in racing. 14. To traverse or go over the steps. He paced the floor nervously. 15. To measure by paces. 16. To train to a certain pace, exercise in pacing, to pace a horse. 17. Of a horse, to run a distance at a pace, amble. 18. To take slow, regular steps. 19. To walk up and down nervously as to expend nervous energy. Webster's Encyclopedic Unabridged Dictionary of the English Language. July 2019. It may seem strange, or it may seem in keeping with the project, Pacing, that 1 year since its 2-year engagement at the Carpenter Center ended, I am still learning about it, studying it, and further engaging with the processes generated then, which continue to take surprising forms. Slowing down to pay close attention, yet steadily continuing to engage, to touch, to feel, to be aware, to be still, and to move, to consciously focus on attention and energy expenditure and circulation. These were some of the initial intentions, thoughts, and motivations. Now I attempt to trace back to early 2016, when I received the invitation to engage with Le Corbusier's Carpenter Center during 2 years. This now seems very distant. In my notebooks, there are indications of thoughts from then, yet in terms of tracing the arc of what ultimately became Pacing, I need to go back further, to 2014. As that year became pivotal in signaling numerous shifts of different kinds. Pacing as a rallying concept and as an expansive framework, serving as an umbrella under which to shelter related emanations and percepts, emerged as I contemplated work I was in the midst of developing, as well as work I had recently produced in 2014. 4 solo exhibitions of my work were meant to take place during 2016. Spacing in Lisbon, Placing in Berlin, Tracing in Como, Italy, and Facing in Toronto. As I accepted the Carpenter Center invitation, I allowed myself the fluidity of not knowing exactly where this might lead, beyond responding to the existing definition of pace and as a verb and gerund, pacing. I wanted to think about particular gerunds I perceived in relation to the work I'd been developing as a form of distillation, and in each case I wanted to think about where I'd been and where I was going. Thinking with pacing allowed a range of possibilities to think in relation. But I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let me return first to 2014. Strange the workings of the mind. Oddly, a sentence returns from childhood, from Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I look it up and find the extended quote and reread it. Yes, it reads like a description of that year, as well as a premonition for things to come. I'm sure it's often quoted these days. Yet specific deaths occurred in 2014, which hit hard, and most affecting being my father's death after a challenging illness at the end of that year, soon after the deaths of two dear old friends, Stuart Hall and Haroun Farouki. In between these, after years of long labor, was the publication of my book of selected writings, Other Planes of There. I was scheduled to open an exhibition at the Schindler House in Los Angeles in January 2015, and in the midst of making the film and the exhibition begin again, the film became a way to convey a lot about my feelings of loss and change, as well as a way to look at the past 127 years, exile experiments and modern architecture relaying into the global conditions of the present C21, 21st century. Schindler's dreams, wishes, and manifesto, combined with others' aspirations during the 20th and 21st centuries, still ongoing, were funneled and circulated through the house via multiple simultaneous soundtracks, films, objects, ephemera, the house itself as a locus for many imaginings. When I was approached with a 2-year invitation as an artist for the institution building framework, suggested by a curator, Jim Voorhees, at the Carpenter Center, I immediately began having ideas. Being allowed to spend an extended period of time to present and develop work sparked the notion of pacing, growing out of and beyond the many pace or pacing definitions cited above. I liked the possibility to study in different ways. Another incentive was to have an opportunity to consider Le Corbusier once again, yet in relation to conditions and contexts, this time intersecting with my daily life, which also appealed to me. To be able to further reflect after the passage of time, having lived through different times and places since having inhabited one of his buildings more than 20 years before. My work, Secret, had grown out of another invitation to engage with the Le Corbusier site, his Unité d'Habitation in Firminy, France. I'd inhabited a unit in the Unité in 1993, and I'd revisited Secret, which is the name of the work I'd made there, in 2006 for an exhibition in Paris to produce additional parts of the work as I continued to think with it. As I interpreted it, the 2016 invitation to engage with the Carpenter Center allowed me to think about Le Corbusier's relations to the Americas, as the Carpenter Center is the only building he was able to realize in North America, despite his ambitious dreams for the continent. I was also intrigued by his relation to the exiled Catalan architect Josep Lluís Sert, then the dean of Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and who issued Le Corbusier the invitation on behalf of Harvard and was instrumental in the building's realization. But I was interested, too, in what seemed to be a lack of relation between Le Corbusier and Rudolf M. Schindler, who also was a European exile born the same year as Le Corbusier. The proposition to work with the entire Carpenter Center was extremely compelling. I wanted a chance to reflect on previous works and interests, to make new work, and to think about where and how, as an artist, work takes place now, as well as for myself, after having worked through the world for many years. I wanted to make a new film that could encompass some of these intimations, and I wanted to put my works in relation, variably, in the Carpenter Center, to experiment with and to test the building. As I lived nearby, I wanted to be able to walk to visit the works and the building and the people who would pass through. I wanted to be in conversation with others. I was and continue to be curious about what is in a locality, and specifically the locality I now inhabit, Cambridge, Boston, Massachusetts, United States, North America, and also in the other locality where Le Corbusier was able to build in the Americas, La Plata, Buenos Aires, Argentina, South America. To think with both hemispheres. This continues an interest in the Americas that began during my childhood and as adolescence. In the present, as an adult, given my years of experiences in many places and spaces, I wanted to focus again and more precisely on what could now be probed of any generative perception of the Americas in relation to speculative past and contemporary worlds, imagined and material. I wanted to differently study and experience the locations I attempt to inhabit and circulate through, via what could happen by paying attention to the developing pacing territories. Fiction and poetry proved to be necessary in this undertaking, along with digging in archives and libraries, seeing, watching, and reading what was found. Harvard's Graduate School of Design is the home of the Le Corbusier Research Collection, which I'd often passed on walks with, and which I could now frequent. The presence of the Harvard Film Archive at the Carpenter Center had another stimulating resonance. I'd first presented at its theater in 2008. I was primed for pacing, and as I continue walking in and around the site, studying and reflecting, pacing continues. When I began the pacing process, I imagined the many things I'd finally be able to realize by being in daily contact for a duration of time with resources such as libraries and research collections that were all within walking distance. In retrospect, in relation to what I've designated as pacing arcs, I find I've filled 37 notebooks from my daily contemplation of the project. The one aspect that involved travel to Argentina was greatly aided by the proximity and knowledge of the librarian of the Le Corbusier Research Collection, who is a native of Argentina, as well as by conversation with others in the vicinity and elsewhere during these past years. Yet many aspects of what I imagined are ongoing. As a daily study, still developing, which in some ways reflect the overall work, which, if defined in particular and in expansive ways, includes varied processes involving contact of diverse kinds through durations of time. Pacing's daily continuation resonates with Muriel Rukeyser's poem, Then. I invoke these words from Rukeyser since hers is one of the lives included in the Selected Life Indexes series, begun in 2005, continuing through 2018, a work included in and shaping the arc between Begin Again, and Pacing's last installment, the exhibition within Living Memory. I continue to think, feel, and wonder with Rukeyser's words in her poem. Then, when I am dead, even then, I will still love you. I will wait in these poems. When I am dead, even then, I am still listening to you. I will still be making poems for you out of silence. Silence will be falling into that silence it is building music. Gesundheit. Now, as I have mentioned, a short film was produced for this project, using materials shot at the Carpenter Center and Casa Courgette in La Plata, Argentina, as I've stated, the only other building he was able to build in the Americas. The film's name is Americas, Veritas. And it is a prelude, I consider it to be a prelude to continued work on a larger film or film series that I'm still in the process of making. And as I will be presenting it in November at the Gallery Nagel-Draxler Cabinet, I thought I'd screen another film tonight, a film produced during the Pacing arc. And that was also shown at Pacing's closing exhibition within Living Memory. The film's title is EDHF and stemmed from an invitation from the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis to produce a work in relation to, or shall I say around, the work of German filmmaker Harun Farocki, whom I knew, and whose affecting death I have noted earlier. It can be described as an essay film, and I think Dietrich already was describing this notion of the essay. I wasn't actually sure it was so widely known in terms of it being a form of film. But in brief, it can be thought of as a form that articulates the formal and aesthetic with historical and the political. And so I wrote the script after having produced a presentation delivered in March of 2017 for the Artist on Artist lecture series. There's an online archive hosted by the Dia Art Foundation in New York. In this series, artists reflect on the practice and works of artists held in the Foundation's collection. For my presentation at Dia, I chose to think about the artist Ankawara and the filmmaker Chantal Akerman, both of whom had recently passed. I consider the short film that we are going to watch now a continuation of my ruminations articulated in that lecture, or as stated in it, a film as a conversation. The film is 33 minutes long, and I'll be happy to answer your questions and continue the conversation after that. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. So if anyone wants to ask a question, this is the time. Dishes is going to.
I was asked to ask exactly the same question, but it's obviously possible that you, yeah. And
thanks so much for the film. It's such a remarkably sustained work of mourning. And I wonder if you could just say a bit more about your sense of the relationship between mourning, the images that you use, and, well, for lack of a better and less technical word, the kind of historical archive that you seem to mine to situate the lives of those who you've lost.
Okay, that's a complex question. Yeah. Thank you. What's to say? I think that maybe in terms of the way that language and the choices intermingle, there's something. I mean, as a film, as it opens, it says it's, words are difficult, and so there's a reason why the images and the sounds work together, and also the words are very sparse in this to give space to other kinds of ways of sensing and seeing perceiving, hearing, and also the pacing that comes back also, I think, throughout it. In terms of the archival material, this is thought very specifically, and also in kind of sometimes counter distinction, and so part of what happens is that there's several things that will be layered, and so what you hear, what you see, and then what the words might be are sometimes working against each other to create another meaning that's not possible to express simply, but they need each other to generate whatever you perceive.
Another question. Over there.
What medium did you use besides obviously film when you had these panels, colored panels in the museum?
Okay.
And then also you had the framed
Okay.
paintings. Were those prints or what medium?
You mean of the color, the structures and media you chose?
Both the structures, but then you also had framed pictures hanging on the wall.
Maybe those are. I'm not exactly
They were
sure which
not-
ones you're referring to. Whether they were you mean the structures that are in space?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Those are the actual textile. You mean
Mm-hmm.
that's used with them? A number
Yeah.
of different kinds. I was lucky enough to work with Knoll,
Mm-hmm.
the company,
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
because I made those works with the Museum of Modern Art
Mm-hmm.
in New York. And so it was possible to use a number of different kinds of textiles that were in the Knoll catalog of fabrics and things. And so there are all kinds of different transparencies and weaves.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
While you're thinking about the questions, we're going to ask F maybe one.
Okay.
The film has like two parts, and the title also has two parts, and there's a slash in between them. I was wondering, of course, maybe other people were too. What is ED?
Okay. Thank you for asking. E stands for extraterritorial, and D stands for durations. And this actually comes from what I mentioned in the beginning about the presentation that I made at the Dia Art Foundation in New York. And if you watch it online, it's sort of articulated in that. But extraterritorial, I was interested in using the word and thinking about the term from George Steiner. It's the title of a book that he published in 1970 called Extraterritorial. And actually the code image is from the original version, a paperback of the book. But I was intrigued by the notion that extraterritorial referred to him thinking about a kind of unhoused relationship to language, and he refers to Nabokov, Borges, and Samuel Beckett in terms of these. He's interested in these three people, and also the way that they were writing in languages that weren't their native languages. So I was really interested in. I mean, this is obscure. This is like my own thing in relationship to thinking about extraterritorial. I mean, informed by something that he had written, but this was the aspect of it that I was interested in. And then durations in terms of just all of the ongoingness that I referred to.
And also the life beyond death.
And the life beyond, yeah. And also thinking about the overlap of the voices in it. Mm-hmm.
A microphone is coming.
I was particularly interested in the looping of the kind of the way that the film began again, or at least its visual element, in combination with the way that you've also mined your own previous works. And it seems that a lot of your work can generate many possibilities for the future, and you kind of ride that. Do you have a foreseen end to these projects?
No. In brief, no, because it's unpredictable. You know, I mean, as is death, the exact moment of when that might happen, and so no, ongoing becoming.
Watching the film, I thought it was striking that there was a strong emphasis all the time on the little details, on the little tiny elements that compose things as well as pictures. You always saw the grain in the pictures and so on, and you saw lots of little waves and lots of leaves of trees and lots of illuminated windows and so on and so on. Why is that important, or is it important?
The details.
Yeah.
I think so.
I mean,
yes. All the details
the
are
is,
important.
The question is,
you noticed them to start with, to be able to even ask about them. And yeah, I think that, I mean, it's not something that it's easy to articulate in words. It has more, I think, to do with other kinds of sensations in combination. And so all of the way that the details are, I mean, in terms of motion, in terms of stillness, light, voluminosity, all kinds of different things are happening simultaneously, but they're layered, and they create some other kind of perception or meaning that you interpret.
I'm curious about the kind of use of poetry to convey kind of the difficulty of actually formulating words and figure and exactness. I think with with images, and if you could talk about the kind of the use of poetry and images to kind of fill in these gaps and try to figure out meaning. Okay,
I guess it's again. Thank you for the question. A certain kind of opening that can occur in the way that poetry can circulate. It's different than maybe articulating a fact about something, even though it has a truth. What occurs in terms of how you receive it can be very different, and so I'm interested often in the way that takes place, in how things that are hard to describe directly, when they are encountered in a more oblique way, the way that they can seep into you like music in a different sort of way than if something direct were stated, that might be something that you might turn away from. I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of how poetry functions. I mean, even the idea of it functioning seems too functive because it's a percept. It's a combination of maybe a concept and a percept, but it seems to act upon people in different kinds of ways. And so it's something that I'm very intrigued by poetry.
Questions? There's one.
Somebody said in the front, that was the first sort of comment, that this was like a very sustained form of mourning for Faruqi, who died in 2014, I think, and it was a very sudden death, and I remember. But it seems to me that somehow there is so much mediation here that makes the morning so not palpable at all. It seems to me that the absence, I mean, first of all, the voiceover, it's not his voice. First I thought it was him talking because I had seen a film of him, but then it's not
That's
him.
interesting
And then the
that you thought
story, the first quotations, he loves these quotations and reminded me of Walter Benjamin's dream that he once wanted to write a book that consisted completely of quotations,
Right.
So so these are his words, and then your words are imposed
There's
on that, and your images, but he's absent.
He's
in a
absent.
strange sense, but
Yeah.
it makes him very present. Was this?
Did you feel that he was present?
I felt that he was present through his absence.
Okay, that's
I
interesting.
don't know if that was actually your intention, but it seemed to me that he wasn't present at all, in the beginning. And then somehow, because it was very elliptical,
Yeah.
the film is very elliptical,
Yeah.
beautiful images, but they're fragments.
Yeah,
So,
I like that.
so that, I wasn't even looking for a story because
Right.
that was really not the point,
No.
not the narrative. But I was actually really wondering if you wanted to make him more present by that absence. It's not his voice. Some of them are his words. It's very impressive, but it's very experimental.
Okay, well, thank you for your comment, Azadeh. The idea in terms of the words, I was searching for his words. And so part of what I was interested in doing when I was researching and working on it was to find instances in which he actually was speaking. And so I did locate this text in a catalog that was devoted to his work. But it was the first time that I had encountered a kind of biographical description by years, and that's where I could hear his voice in that, and I wanted that to be something that would draw you in a different kind of way. But what I mentioned in the beginning about the film as a conversation, or that comes up in the film itself, film as a conversation, it's between me and him. That's the conversation going on, and so. No, he's, it's me imagining all kinds of different things, but then I think there are moments when his voice comes through, I think his voice is recognizable.
I had a question, actually.
Yeah, this is,
Exact same question.
excuse me, this is one more question.
This is the final question.
The last two questions then. Please both of you.
No, it's actually related to what Azad
And
just said.
speak, and you get it, you need
Yeah,
a
sorry, I
microphone.
don't have a microphone.
You get it.
I had a question very related to that. Was that I kept wondering with the voice over that you chose.
Yes. Oh, okay.
And I did think that this was your voice and also his voice in the, not the voiceover, but the dead. So I thought that this is your voice blending in with his or honoring his one, whichever. And then I wonder what
Suki,
made
do you mean the voiceover that was the
not the
voice that
voiceover.
was chosen?
No,
Okay.
not the voiceover. But I think that I thought that this is actually one of those cases of subject and narrator blending. I thought. So his quotes are there, but your quotes are there constantly, right? But then how did you choose the voiceover? Because I imagined it to be a woman, and I think I was really taken aback by the voice and even also his accent.
Yeah, South African. Yeah. And young. I think I wanted that voice. When I heard it, I thought it would work in an interesting way. Also, to create something that was another thing, something that you don't know exactly, something that's more mysterious. Yet at the same time seems to go in sync with the other elements.
Last question, please.
So as it is some ongoing becoming, to what extent would you say does it change you while working and while producing this? And maybe reinventing you or shape your becoming?
That's an interesting question. I guess because I am in that process, it's difficult for me to say because there's not an end point there. So it's that too is ongoing. And so with the repetition of being able to watch films and also to make them, that involves a lot of, the duration that takes place. And then when you can repeat watching something over time, that also affects like how it's possible to perceive and imagine.
Also the fact that you're concentrating on his formative years in the biography.
Exactly, I don't go
Years in which
beyond.
he's becoming,
Exactly, because there's a lot more. I didn't know, but that's what I was interested in, what I didn't know, and what I could find, and interpret. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you all.